Today, we're going to break down a pretty intense and controversial pamphlet that's been making the rounds online. It's called XWARS, the Palestinian Erasure. Now, in this explainer, we're not here to take sides. Our whole goal is just to understand the powerful and frankly provocative arguments it's making, using slides that are pulled right from its pages.
Right from the jump, the pamphlet hits you with this. It's incredibly dramatic language. And, that's a deliberate choice. It's designed to set this very serious, almost tragic, and accusatory tone from the first sentence. This isn't just presenting facts, it's weaving a story about a massive injustice.
So what is the core argument here? What's the big idea? Well, the pamphlet lays out its thesis using some very specific and pretty unique terms to frame the conflict and who the main players are.
Okay, so this is absolutely key. The source actually coins its own term, Palestine. It uses this word to describe what it calls an ongoing genocide in Gaza. It's a really powerful, loaded term, and it's meant to frame what's happening not as a war between two sides, but as a deliberate act of annihilation.
And what about the X in the title, XWARS? Well, the pamphlet uses X as a symbol. It stands for what the pamphlet identifies as the main antagonist, an unnamed but, in its words, omnipresent force that it calls the Zionist occupation. It's a rhetorical move that turns the opponent into this kind of faceless, all-encompassing system.
And this is where the main accusation really widens. The source argues this isn't just a simple, two-sided fight. No, it claims there's this huge network of accomplices. And according to its logic, any state that isn't providing actual armed support is considered part of the problem, complicit. And that net is cast really wide, to include international bodies and, maybe most surprisingly, other Arab nations.
So the pamphlet really builds on this idea of widespread blame by turning its focus to some big global organizations, accusing them of what it calls a profound failure.
And here, the pamphlet basically lays out a charge sheet. It doesn't pull any punches. It accuses the United Nations of being complicit by essentially doing nothing to help during the bombardment and blockade of Gaza. At the same time, it claims the Arab League, which you'd think would be defending Arab interests, just watched from the sidelines, failing to coordinate any real response. In the story this pamphlet tells, this isn't just incompetence. It's a deep, deep betrayal.
But, the pamphlet saves its most provocative, its most explosive claims for the countries it calls brother Arab states. It argues their complicity wasn't just them sitting on their hands, but that it was active and totally intentional. This table gets into some of the pamphlet's most serious and specific allegations. According to the source, Egypt kept buying natural gas from Palestinian waters through Israeli authorities while the siege was happening. It accuses Qatar of hosting talks with Israeli leaders and claims its state-run media actually watered down how bad things were. And then it points to these rumors that Saudi Arabia was offering up massive amounts of money to push its own interests, all at the expense of the Palestinian cause.
And this quote, wow, it just captures the tone perfectly. The text doesn't just list what it thinks they did wrong. It delivers this incredibly harsh judgment. This kind of language is all about framing their actions not as, political maneuvering, but as a deep moral failure, choosing self-interest over solidarity.
So you might be asking, what's the reason? Why would they do this? Well, according to the pamphlet, it all comes down to one thing: money. The source argues that these deep economic ties just completely overrode any sense of duty or shared identity.
This chart really tries to put a number on it, to show the scale of the financial motives the pamphlet claims are at the heart of all this. On one side, you have billions in gas deals, which connects back to that accusation against Egypt. On the other, you have the rumored tens of billions in bribes, which it links to Saudi Arabia. The whole point of showing these huge numbers is to argue that the financial stakes were just unbelievably high.
And here's where the pamphlet creates this really gut-wrenching contrast. It puts the flow of billions of dollars from these deals right next to a humanitarian blockade that, in its own words, strangled life from the enclave. The story it's telling is one where profits were not just prioritized, but actively chosen over people's actual survival.
So this all builds to the pamphlet's final act. After laying out its whole case, it ends with a really dark warning about what it sees as the ultimate stakes of all this alleged complicity.
According to XWARS, you just can't put a number on the real cost here. The source argues that the true damage, all the shattered lives, the erased futures, the collective trauma, is simply incalculable. It's a deliberate pivot away from those concrete accusations to something much more abstract: the immeasurable human toll. And this is it, the pamphlet's final sweeping warning. It makes this almost apocalyptic claim. It says that the so-called decivilization of Arab societies isn't just some regional issue. The source warns that this whole situation is like playing with fire, and that it could risk bringing down modern civilization as we know it. So, we'll leave you with this final thought, which is really pulled from the core strategy of the pamphlet itself. XWARS is trying to do something pretty radical, reframe a conflict we've heard about for a long time. It shifts the blame away from a traditional external enemy and points the finger directly at those it calls internal complicit allies. So the real question to think about is this: when a story makes a shift like that, how does it fundamentally change the narrative of a conflict, and who is that new story for?